Hello, everybody. That was Lisa Murphy playing that well-known tune beautifully. And it's welcome from me to the Tyneside Irish Cultural Society's first ever webinar. This one tonight is very special for me because it's dedicated to the life and achievements of Ciaran Carson, of who you're going to hear a lot about in the next hour. Now, just a technical word before we get going. You'll notice your video and audio are turned off, but you will be able to join in the question and answer session at the end of the discussion by simply switching the button on the bottom of your screen. And you can type in a question at any time during the webinar as we roll along, and we'll pick them up at the end. Now, just a word about Ciaran Carson as a musician. He was a great musician, but as a musician, you would couldn't find a better book about Irish music than his classic Last Night's Fun. It's such an amazing book, so original. Only a poet like himself, I suppose, could have written it. His talent as a writer, a musician, and a poet could have filled many more lives than the one he was granted. But in a way, all his talents aided one another and made him a richer, all-rounded person. He was a total original who prized his originality and spontaneity, but this spontaneity was based on his depth of knowledge of the Irish language, of the Irish folklore and music. Last Night's Fun, if you've never read it, and if you like Irish music, you really should do. Its title, like all the chapters in the book, is taken from the title of an Irish dance tune. Last Night's Fun is a famous reel, and it refers in Ciaran's life to one of his favorite occupations. That's going to the session, going to the music session, usually in the pub, nearly always in the pub. And that sort of satisfied feeling he had when recovering from the session in the night before was to sort of tucking into the restorative powers of a good Ulster fry. Well, that's enough from me. We're really lucky tonight to have with us a man who's an expert on all kinds of literature, and in particular Irish literature, and has a great knowledge of Ciaran's work. Our very good friend, Professor Stephen Regan of the University of Durham. Welcome, Stephen. He's going to host the night for us. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Tony. Am I there on the video? Hello, everyone, and I hope you're all keeping well. Welcome to this special celebration of the life and work of Ciaran Carson. It's really important during these times of lockdown and isolation that we stay in good spirits. And maybe it's in times like these that we come to appreciate the value and importance of culture and the role that literature and music and art have in sustaining us, giving us a sense of common purpose and endeavour. So when Barbara and Tony mentioned the idea of doing an event online, I immediately wanted to be involved. I've given many talks at the Tyneside Irish Centre over the years. On one occasion, I gave a talk on Patrick Kavanagh, and I remember looking down and seeing on the table in front of me 3 pints of Guinness, 3 large whiskies that had just magically appeared. And I remember thinking I could get used to this kind of public speaking. Apparently it was a very good talk. Sadly, we don't have the atmosphere of the bar at Gallagate tonight, but we do have a good feeling of being together, and I hope that we're all going to enjoy tonight's event. Ciaran Carson was a very accomplished musician, as Tony has said, as well as a writer. So we wanted this evening to pay tribute to that part of his work. And I'm very pleased to say that I'm joined tonight by an immensely talented group of friends, and I'll introduce them to you now. Lisa Murphy, playing the whistle, as you've heard. Ceallach Reid, singing and playing guitar. Davina Reid, reading some early poems by Ciaran Carson. And Gary Wade, reading some poems that have a connection with Ciaran's close contemporary, Seamus Heaney. If you're wondering if Ceallach and Davina are sisters by any chance, then I have to tell you, you're absolutely right. And it's a great opportunity for them to see each other tonight. As Tony said, this is the first time we've tried anything like this. We've had just one brief rehearsal. So I hope you'll be patient with us and be patient with the technology. The tune that Lisa started with was Down by the Sally Gardens. It was a tune that was very dear to Ciaran Carson. It was made popular, of course, as a poem by W.B. Yeats, but Yeats had in fact first heard it as an Irish song. He first published it under the title An Old Song Re-Sung. I didn't know until Ciaran told me that it was actually part of a much longer work, the English title of which was The Rambling Boys of Pleasure. And he immediately sang it in full, even though we were sitting in a cafe at the time. When he visited Newcastle a few years ago, he stayed at the Station Hotel. And I remember him taking his whistle from his pocket at breakfast and just playing and singing to everyone's delight. He was just a natural and instinctive performer. I'd like to tell you a little bit about him before we look at some of his work. He was born in Belfast in 1948, and he grew up in an Irish-speaking family. English, which was the language in which he wrote, was in fact his second language. His father was a leading member of the Esperanto Society. Esperanto, as you probably know, being an international contact language, was especially popular in the 1950s when Ciaran was growing up because it had had the backing of the United Nations. Ciaran's father was also a postman whose intimate knowledge of the Belfast streets seems to shape Ciaran's work, as we'll see. His father was born in April 1916, and he liked to claim he was born on Easter Monday, though that turned out to be a myth. In fact, I think he was born 10 days earlier. But Ciaran remained deeply interested in the events of 1916, all the songs and stories that came out of it. His mother, Mary McGinn, had worked in the linen mills, and she met Ciaran's father at Irish language classes. They both believed passionately in education as a form of social advancement, and so it was to be. Ciaran was taught by the Christian Brothers. He then attended Queen's University, Belfast, in the late 1960s. And this is at a time when Northern Irish poetry, of course, is flourishing. He was preceded by Seamus Heaney, who was later one of his tutors at Queen's, and Michael Longley and Derek Mahon, both part of that group. And Ciaran was himself part of a slightly younger generation that included Paul Muldoon and Maeve McGuckian. He went on to work for the Arts Council of Northern Ireland, and later he became director of the Seamus Heaney Centre at Queen's. And as Tony has suggested, he wrote far more than poetry. He wrote novels and memoirs. He wrote about the city of Belfast. He published a book that we've heard about on traditional Irish music. He was a prolific translator. One of the things I remembered just today was that he'd done an award-winning translation of Dante's Inferno. So very well read and very knowledgeable about international literature. But it is the poetry that we're going to concentrate on tonight. And I thought a good starting point would be his poem titled 1798, which I know was one of the poems he often started his readings with. In fact, he nearly always started with the whistle or the flute, and then this particular poem 1798. I'm now going to be ambitious and try to share this poem with you on my own screen, if Barbara is able to admit this. Just see if I can call this up. I hope that you'll be able to see this. Here we are. And here is Ciaran with his flute. Two things I should say about the poem just before we read it. It obviously alludes to the 1798 rebellion. And of course, many famous songs like The Wearing of the Green and The Rising of the Moon, songs that Ciaran liked to play, came out of that. Incidentally, today is the anniversary of the death of Wolfe Tone. I don't know if you were aware of that. 222 years to the day. So it's very apt, perhaps we should be looking at this. The other thing I want to say about it is that it's an ashling. That is, it's part of that tradition of dreams and visions in which the speaker meets Ireland in the figure of a woman who tells him of her sorrows and prophesies that one day Ireland will be free. 1798. I met her in the garden where the poppies grow, quite over canopied with luscious woodbine, and her cheeks were like roses or blood dropped on snow. Her pallid lips were red with papal Spanish wine. Lulled in these wild flowers with dance and delight, I took my opportunity and grasped her hand. She then disclosed the eyelids of her second sight and prophesied that I'd forsake my native land. Before I could protest, she put her mouth to mine and sucked the broken English from my Gaelic tongue. She wound me in her briery arms of eglantine. 2 centuries have gone, yet she and I abide, like emblems of a rebel song no longer sung, or snowy blossoms drifting down the mountainside. Well, there's no doubt that Ciaran Carson was attracted by the seductive glamour of revolutionary songs and ballads, but one of the things he seems to be doing here is to dissolve the myths and fantasies that have hardened around historical events and their monumental dates. He lets dream and fantasy wash over the fixed terrain of sectarian politics, countering violence with images of peace and sleep, such as we get at the end of the poem. It's as if he recognizes both the popularity and the persistence of these songs and at the same time disarms them. That recollection at the end of a rebel song no longer sung reminds us that this was written in the aftermath of the IRA ceasefire in 1994, when of course there was a good deal of talk about decommissioning. One of the sources for this, interestingly, is probably Dark Rosaleen by James Clarence Mangan, based on the songs and stories of Roisin Douf. And one of the other sources that Ciaran probably went to, was Thomas MacDonagh's very important book. It's often forgotten that in the year he was executed for his part in the Easter Rising, he published this book, Literature in Ireland. One of the things he talks about is the ashling tradition. And he says at one point that, like the Elizabethan sonnet in England, of which many thousands were published between Sydney and Shakespeare, the Irish ashling became a craze. Well, Ciaran picks up this form, but he also crosses it with the sonnet, interestingly. So if we look at it here on the page, we can see that it's in the 14 lines of the sonnet. He's printed it with 2 quatrains, making up 8 lines, and 2 tercets of 3. So you've got 14 lines. It's based partly on Shakespeare's sonnets, but each line is much longer than you would normally get in a Shakespearean sonnet. So if you look at the opening line, for instance, and you were to count the syllables, there are 12 rather than 10. It's a French line of poetry known as the Alexandrine. So he's very skillful and he's very musical in what he's doing. And he's also very cleverly echoing Shakespeare. So the reference to the luscious woodbine and the eglantine, these are from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. But the closing line, of course, brings us to a very famous Irish song, doesn't it? Oh, Danny boy, the pipes are calling from glen to glen and down the mountainside. So it's a very skillful poem, full of allusions. Now, the next poem that I'd like to introduce us to is probably one of his best known poems, if not the best known poem he wrote. This is a poem titled Belfast Confetti. Belfast confetti apparently was a term that was used to describe the metal shavings from the Belfast shipyards, but it became associated in popular speech with shrapnel from bomb explosions, stuff getting thrown around in the midst of riots, as Ciaran goes on to explain. He said in an interview that we'd normally think of confetti as something light and something associated with celebration, but here it's something dark and heavy. And this particular poem looks back to a riot in Belfast in August 1969. I'm hoping that we can listen to Ciaran himself sharing it, if this works. This is
Belfast confetti. Suddenly, as the riot squad moved in, it was raining exclamation marks, nuts, bolts, nails, car keys, a fount of broken type, and the explosion itself an asterisk on the map. This hyphenated line, a burst of rapid fire. I was trying to complete a sentence in my head, but it kept stuttering, all the alleyways and side streets blocked with stops and colons. I know this labyrinth so well, Balaclava, Raglan, Inkerman, Odessa Street, why can't I escape? Every move is punctuated. Crimea Street, dead end again. A Saracen, Kremlin to Mesh, Macron face shields, walkie-talkies. What is my name? Where am I coming from? Where am I going? A fusillade of question marks.
It's really good to hear Ciaran's voice. And here is the poem on the page. What makes it such a special poem, I think, is that it's not just a description of violence on the streets. It's more a demonstration of the poem itself under pressure, bending and twisting, but also resisting that pressure. It's almost as if violence is permeating every part of private as well as public life, even the writing of poetry. So this is a text that is itself violently disrupted. Grammar and punctuation seem to enact the experience on the streets. So the explosion is an asterisk on the map. The hyphen is a burst of fire. Streets are blocked with stops and colons. Ironically, the writer is trapped on the streets of his own home. In fact, Ciaran grew up on Raglan Street, one of the streets he mentions and perhaps remembers that these street names recall imperial battles. Some of the language of this is very harsh, isn't it? Kremlin 2 mesh and mackerel on face shields. It's not the kind of language we expect in lyrical poetry, but that's part of the risk and part of the experiment that he wants to carry out. And those questions at the end, they're partly questions of interrogation, but they're questions of a much deeper existential kind that might be asked of the self in such a conflict. Where am I going? He asks. Well, I think it's time for a song now, and I'm going to hand over to Ceallach for a song that takes us back to Easter 1916, in fact.
As we gather in the chapel here in Old Kilmainham Jail, I think about these past few days. Oh, will they say we failed? From our school days they have taught us we must yearn for liberty. But all I want in this dark place is to have you here with me. Oh, grace, just hold me in your arms and let this moment linger. They take me at dawn and I will die. With all my love I replace this wedding ring upon your finger. There won't be time to share our love, for we must say goodbye. Now I know it's hard for you, my love, to ever understand the love I have for these brave men, the love for my dear land. But when heartbreak called me to its side down in the GPO, I had to leave my own bed. To him I had to go. Oh, grace, just hold me in your arms and let this moment linger. They'll take me at dawn and I will die. With all my love I place this wedding ring upon your finger. There won't be time to share our love, for we must say goodbye. Now as the dawn is breaking, my heart is breaking too. On this May morn as I walk out, my thoughts will be of you. And I write some words upon the wall for everyone to see. I love so much that I could see his blood upon the rose. Oh, grace, just hold me in your arms and let this moment linger. They take me at dawn and I will die. With all my love I place this wedding ring upon your finger. There won't be time to share our love, for we must say goodbye.
Ciaran, thank you very much for that beautiful rendition of Grace. So we're going to move from the beautiful voice of Ciaran to the voice of a blackbird. I'm going to read two of poems of Carson's, one of which was partly inspired by a poem of Seamus Heaney's, who of course Carson knew very well, as Stephen said. And both Heaney's and Carson's poems are translations of a 9th century Irish poem called The Blackbird of Belfast Lough. The background to the poem is that in 2003, Carson became the director of the Seamus Heaney Centre at Queen's in Belfast. And on the day he began as director, he recalls walking up to the building and seeing a small blackbird, as he says, scuffling around in the shrubbery. And he instantly thought of the Irish poem and then of Heaney's translation. In Heaney's version of the poem, he uses the Old English word neb, N-E-B, to describe the blackbird's beak. But neb can also mean the point or the nib of a pen, which is how Carson translates it. So there's a sense in both poems of the neb or the nib as the origin of the bird's song, and perhaps to it might well act as a metaphor for the origin of poetry. And in fact, the literary journal of the Seamus Heaney Centre for Poetry is called the Yellow Nib. And then at the end of the poem, there's a lovely description of the yellow windbush or gorse from which the bird sings its song. So I read Seamus Heaney's translation first, and then Ciaran Carson's. The Blackbird of Belfast Lough. The small bird chirruped, yellow ned, and note spurt. Blackbird over lagging water, clumps of yellow windburst. And then Ciaran Carson's translation. The little bird that whistled shrill from the nib of its yellow bill, a note let go o'er Belfast Lough, a blackbird from a yellow wind. The second Carson poem I want to read is his elegy for Seamus Heaney, who died in 2013. It's a beautiful poem which plays on an early poem of Heaney's in Death of a Naturalist, which many of you will know, called Personal Helicon. And in that poem, Heaney writes about his fascination with whales as a child and the echoes they gave back, but insists that as an adult, it is his poetry and not whales which will provide the echoes of his childhood. And Carson very cleverly picks this up and plays with it. So you'll see from the screen, thanks to Stephen, even the layout of the poem is playful. The lines are very truncated. The longest is 6 words, and the final 3 are just single words. So the poem actually looks like a long, narrow well. And as you get to its end, even the words begin to fade away. And it reflects, of course, the dying out of Heaney's own words with his death in 2013. So the poem is called In Memory. As he told it, when the boy he was stumbled on the well in the derelict brick yard, deep as a brick mill chimney. Leaning over the rim, he shouted the 2 syllables of his name deep down into it to hear his echo. Now that the man he would become is dead, that unfathomable darkness echoes still.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, Lisa, thank you for that beautiful tune. The two poems that I will recite are entitled Suit and the Rosary Rally. They're both early poems by Ciaran Carson dating from the 1970s. They're domestic poems dealing in different ways with memories of home and with domestic life. And the first poem, Suit, is unusual in the way that it tells the story of a domestic encounter between a woman at home and a visiting chimney sweep. It catches the tension in the air, noting the woman's concern for the house and her fears of the chimney sweep's rough intrusion. It also draws attention to the lack of speech between them and the woman's seeming resentment at having to hand over money. The initial setting is not very promising. However, the poem places against these apparent negatives a set of far more promising and positive images. The sweep's brush emerges from the chimney triumphantly like a sunflower in bloom, and the fire burns cleanly. Even better, the soot that she throws on the flower beds eventually appears as the ink bruise in the pansy's heart. The poem opens in autumn and ends in spring. Like other poems by Ciaran Carson, it finds beauty unexpectedly in dark places. Suit. It was autumn. First, she shrouded the furniture, then rolled back the carpet as if for dancing, then moved the ornaments from the mantelpiece, afraid his roughness might disturb their staid fragility. He came. Shyly she let him in, feeling ill at ease in the newly spacious room, her footsteps sounding hollow on the boards. She watched him kneel before the hearth and said something about the weather. He did not answer, too busy with his work for speech. The stem of yellow cane creaked upwards tentatively. After a while, he asked her to go outside and look, and there, above the roof, she saw the frayed sunflower bloom triumphantly. She came back and asked how much she owed him, grimacing as she put the money in his soiled hand. When he had gone, a weightless hush lingered in the house for days. Slowly it settled. The fire burned cleanly. Everything was spotless. Hearing that soot was good for the soil, she threw it on the flower beds. She would watch it crumble, dissolving in the rain, finding its way to lightless crevices, sleeping till in spring it would emerge softly as the ink bruise in the pansy's heart. The Rosary Rally is the second poem that I will recite. It takes its inspirational from the Catholic devotion and communal prayer that Carson was familiar with in his childhood and adolescence. Growing up in the late 1940s and 50s, he was also exposed to continuing fears of nuclear war and the threat of communism. Poetry begins to take shape in the intersection of politics and prayer. What the poem refers to as the cloud of my dreams is not an innocent image, but a reference to nuclear explosion. Prayer perhaps eases the young poet into writing. He tells us, I tried to think of the words, the lull before each mystery, which may describe both the rosary and the writing of poetry. The final lines find something of beauty once again in an unpromising setting. The coming rain, an allusion to war as well as the weather, prompts the young writer to look up and see stars between the clouds, a mystical image and one offering hope of light and salvation. The Rosary Rally. It was the 1st of May. The crowd spilled out from the convent field. White flowers nodded on the tarred road. Everyone was praying hard. The World War was to come, if not tomorrow, then the next day or the next. From Nagasaki, Hiroshima, the white cloud drifted nearer, nearer, so quietly it would be there before you saw it coming. It was the cloud of my dreams, thick and noiseless everywhere. Decades of the rosary passed. We saw the troops march on the red square of Russia. My mother wiped her hands, then went to make the tea. When everything was cleared away, we all knelt down. I tried to think of the words, the lull before each mystery. All there was the sound of coming rain, a light touch on the window, then the clouds and the stars between the clouds.
Oh, the summertime is coming, and the trees are sweetly blooming, and the wild mountain thyme grows around the blooming heather. Where you go, lassie, go, and we'll all go together to block wild mountain thyme all around the blooming heather. Where you go, lassie, go, I will build my love a tower neon pure crystal fountain, and on it I will grow all the flowers of the mountain. Where you go, lassie, go, and we'll all go together to block wild mountain thyme all around the blooming heather. Where you go, lassie, go. If my true love she were gone, I would surely find another where wild mountain thyme grows around the blooming heather. Where you go, lassie, go, and we'll all go together to block wild mountain thyme all around the blooming heather. Where you go, lassie, go.
Kayla, Thank you so much, Kayla. That was just captivating. In case you're wondering why Kayla was singing The Wild Mountain Thyme, it's well known in several versions as a Scots song, of course, but in fact the version that Kayla sang was composed and first recorded by a Belfast man, Francis McPeak, in the 1950s. And Ciaran was very much drawn to the idea that songs and tunes could travel that way. And in fact, he liked The Wild Mountain Thyme so much. He included it in a virtuoso piece he wrote titled Whiskey. And Whiskey's part of a sequence, just a very playful sequence he wrote, trying to write a poem for every letter of the alphabet, beginning with Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and then eventually reaching Victor, Whiskey, X-ray. And it's a reminder that Ciaran Carson was a musician who loved to improvise and riff. So I'm just going to see if I can find the poem Whiskey for you. It was very much a kind of performance piece that he liked to do. And I think improvisation is probably a good way of describing it. He begins with the idea that whiskey is the water of life. And then he just lets words and ideas associate freely with each other. From whiskey and water, we go to Guinness and the Liffey. From cocktails, we go to explosives, Molotov cocktails. From the heather and peat of Scotch whiskey, we go to pochine and turf. And from there to coal and coke. From coke, we go to cocaine. Then we go from intoxicating liquids to mind-expanding drugs. Not quite sure how much of this Ciaran was on, but I know he liked his whiskey very much. And he concludes by admitting that he's maybe become a bit distracted and hasn't said much at all in this poem. But I think there's a serious point about language as naming and how slippery the act of naming is, because as a poet, what you're doing much of the time is giving names to things. So let's finish with some whiskey, which sounds like a very good idea. Of how the life of water is distilled to liquid gold, how the water of the Liffey becomes Guinness, how explosive cocktails take the name of Molotov, how the wild mountain thyme blows around the blooming heather, and the perfumed smoke of pochine rises high into the azure sky. How turf is the conducive agent and not coke. How coke is crack, not heroin nor smack. How marijuana is la cucaracha, Mary Jane or blow. How many states of mind there are in Appalachia. How you turn into an insect overnight or after hours from eating magic mushrooms. How the psilocybin got your brain and led to some strange meeting. How the tongue gets twisted, how barbarian is everyone who is not Greek. How things are named by any other name except themselves. Thereof I meant to speak. Well, I hope very much that you've enjoyed the evening and that we've been able to share with you some of the work of Ciaran Carson and the music that he loved. We're going to close with a tune that Ciaran knew well. It's the Skylark, and a skylark is sure to lift our hearts, I think. So over to Lisa.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Lisa. Thank you, everybody. We're not quite finished yet because we're going to have a question and answer session. We've a little bit of time left, and I think we've got plenty of questions lined up. I've got one that was sent to me earlier, and Stephen, it's for you. I referred originally to the multifaceted talents of Ciaran, and how one may be influenced and aided another one. How do you think Ciaran's work as a musician shaped the way he wrote his prose and poetry, his style and the subject matter he chose?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tony. So at one level, lots of titles of songs come into his work, and I think we've seen that just in the small selection we've had tonight, that songs are always in his mind. But it's more than just the content. I think a lot of his writing is very, very musical. And he said at one point that spending a lot of time in pubs playing music really helped him, because there were occasions when he thought, I couldn't really stand up here and read the poems I've written so far. It wouldn't be quite right. So he started to write in a way that I think made his poems more fitting to the sessions that he used to enjoy taking part in. And then after a while, I think he felt he'd overdone that, and he had to shift his style a little bit. But yeah, it's a very, very musical style. You can see that in his head often are songs, and there are very popular melodies that come through and shape some of the pieces he's writing. So I think that was right what you said, Tony, about it being an integral talent. You know, the two interests, the two talents working so closely together.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think one thing you learn as a traditional musician in Ireland, especially if you enter competitions, is that you must never play this tune the same way twice. For example, and Lisa will know this very much as a whistle player. If you enter a standard Culturierian competition, you'll be asked to play a tune twice, and the second time you play it has got to be a variant on the first time you play it. And I think Ciaran he says in last night's fun, you can never play the same tune twice, even if you play it. You never play it the same if you play it 100 times. You know, you've always got to find another way of doing it. And the other thing about Irish music is that nothing really is right and nothing is wrong. Classical musicians find it very, very difficult to come to terms with. I've got one more question really about Ciaran's legacy for you, Stephen. I mean, he's not probably well known. We said this in the rehearsal. He's probably not as well known as he deserves to be, as his talent deserves to be. And will his legacy be greater than his lifetime achievement? I tend to think it might well be, that if people got to know his work a little bit better and appreciate it a little bit better, I think his fame might grow, sadly, after his life has ended. What do you think about that? Is the best of Ciaran Carson yet to come?
I think so. I think his reputation's growing all the time, Tony. And one of the indications of that is that there's a lot of interest in places like Poland and Sweden and Japan, where he spent a little bit of time. I think anywhere there's an interest in linguistic inheritance, and where there's more than one language to think about, and where there are strong musical traditions. I mentioned Esperanto, which his father strangely was involved in. I don't know how his father ended up being such a prominent figure in this. I think just a love of languages. But Esperanto came from Poland. I think it was a Polish doctor at the end of the 19th century who devised this language that could be used across nations. And I was just looking recently at a book on Ciaran. I think it had started as a PhD thesis by a student at the University of Warsaw. And of course, students in Poland often have Russian, German, French, English, as well as Polish. So I think there's that admiration for what Ciaran is doing. I know of people in Sweden, for instance, with a really strong interest in his work. Sometimes I go to conferences and I get this sense that he's read very, very widely. And of course, in the US, they think of him very, very highly. His work is in print over there. He had a lot of trips to the US. He was always very, very warmly received. So yeah, I think there's a legacy there that will continue to grow, and a kind of burgeoning international reputation.
Thank you, Stephen. Maybe after you write your book about Ciaran, that'll really establish him.
When I retire, I might do it.
Would any of our other panelists like to ask ask Stephen a question tonight, or anyone? Gary, do you want to come back and say a few words before we wind up?
Oh, thank you, Tony. No, it's I mean, I know more about Seamus Heaney, a little more than Ciaran Carson, but I know, I mean, they were friendly, Stephen, and do you think to what extent did they play off each other's poetry or not?
Yeah, that's it's really important, Gary, isn't it? Because Ciaran had worked closely with Seamus Heaney at Queen's, and then Seamus Heaney, as you know, brought out a book titled North. It was very controversial, and Ciaran had reviewed it not altogether positively. You know, he was worried about the way in which violence had been approached, and the way in which Heaney had made use of myth and history. Some people thought there was something Oedipal going on there, you know, that the student was maybe kicking back at the master, possibly. But there was always a mutual respect, very definitely, and you can see that. And I like to think that Seamus Heaney had maybe taken on board some of the lessons that Ciaran had to show poetry writers. But the elegy that you read for him shows the depth of Ciaran Carson's affection and respect and love of Heaney, doesn't it? It's such a great poem. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah. Well, I'd just like to say thanks to all of our panelists tonight, Gary and Lisa and Davina and Kayla. It's been great to do this and to feel that you know, even though we're at a distance, there's a sense of intimacy. It's strange actually that we can get this sense of being together. Even though we're doing this online, and I really hope we'll get more chances to do it. And also I want to say thank you to everyone at the Tyneside Irish Centre, everyone involved in the Cultural Society, Barbara, Carol, Paul, and everyone, and Tony, of course. So thank you very much for making this possible for us, and let's do something like this again. I'd love to be involved.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Stephen, and thanks to my seconder. Thanks to everybody involved tonight. I've just got to make a quick plug for the next event. We're a bit like the Newcastle buses, the old trolley buses used to be. Nothing happens, and then we have a glut. It's next Wednesday, I think it is, and I hope somebody correct me if I'm wrong. Next Wednesday, we have another webinar, this time about Seamus Heaney, indeed. and it's arranged for us by Conall Parr from the University of Northumbria, and it's featuring His Eminence, Professor Roy Foster, the biographer, of course, of Seamus Heaney, and we have also the poems read by Adrian Dunbar, who's appearing just in the line of duty. So I hope lots of you will tune in for that. And just that's next Wednesday. It's on the 25th of November. The details are on the website, Tyneside Irish. Just tune into that. I thought maybe, Stephen, we could ask Lisa, if she's not put her whistle away, to just finish off with another rendition of the Skylark, just especially for me, because I think it's fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody.
It's a great
Go on,
idea.
will you? Good night. God bless.
Tony,
Good
thank you,
night, everyone.
Stephen.
Good night.
Lovely.